Want to invite up to the stage Dr. Samin Vazir. She is professor in the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences at the University of Melbourne. Her research examines the individual and institutional practices and norms in science and the degree to which these norms encourage or impede scientific self-correction. She co-founded the Society for the Improvement of Psychological Science and serves on the board of directors of the Public Library of Science and the Berkeley Initiative for Transparency in the Social Sciences. She served on the National Academy of Sciences Study Committee on replicability and reproducibility in science. She has served as editor-in-chief at 3 journals and associate editor at 7 journals, and is currently the editor-in-chief of Psychological Science. Welcome, Dr. Vazir.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me here. I'll start with my disclosures. So as it was mentioned, I'm editor-in-chief of Psychological Science. I'm a board member at PLOS. I'm speaking only in my personal capacity here, not for any of these organizations. And so I'm also an academic, and so I wear different hats, and I find some conflict between these different roles, specifically around the role of journals and journal prestige. So in my role as an academic, I'm often working to try to work against the system where journals are so entrenched and trying to shift to a different model of publishing and peer review and so on. And then I wear my hat as editor-in-chief of a journal, so in my first hat, I don't really want people to use journal name as an indicator of anything. I want research to be evaluated on its own merits. I don't think journal name should be a proxy for quality. And then in my hat as editor-in-chief of a journal, I want our journal name to stand for something. I want people to have positive associations with it, to think it's a good thing. So I think a lot about, where does journal prestige come from? What should it mean? What should we do about it? And in my experience, and all of this is going to be very psychology specific, but hopefully I'm curious to hear how it relates to other disciplines. But at least in psychology, journal reputation comes from a few places. So what the journal says about itself, what it says its aims and scope are, we take that somewhat at face value and say, okay, it's this kind of journal. Of course, it comes from how selective the journal is and things like its impact factor. Those play a big role in how much prestige we give to journals. But actually, when I do the thought experiment of imagine a journal that is very prestigious by these standards and so on, and then these things change. Maybe they become less selective or their impact factor goes down. Or imagine the opposite. Imagine a journal that isn't really well respected, or people haven't even heard of it, but then it's very selective and its impact factor goes up. In my experience, reputations and prestige are really, really sticky, and they don't change that fast. So that suggests that it's not just, we look at the impact factor, we think, great journal, right? It's more complicated than that. And there's a lot of inertia in journal prestige. It's very hard to change. It's shockingly hard for a journal to lose its prestige. At least I think that there's been some evidence of that in some fields. So that makes me think about, well, how does this happen? What's going on? And importantly, does journal prestige track quality? I mean, journals can change dramatically from one editorship to another, at least in journals where there's academic editors, so there's a lot of change from one team to another, and yet the reputation tends to roll over and stick. So it seems like there's got to be at least some noise in the system, and that the signal of journal prestige can't be completely accurate. And for whatever it's worth, which is not much, my own impression is that journal prestige probably tracks quality positively. There's probably positive correlation across all journals. The more prestigious ones probably are better than the less prestigious ones. But I think it gets a lot messier when we talk about just like top tier journals. So among the journals that people strive to publish in, who are research active and so on, the most competitive journals, I don't know that there's a positive correlation between prestige and quality. Again, speaking for psychology, I think we don't know, and more importantly, we can't know. It's very hard to answer that question. It's really, really hard to know which journals are actually publishing better research. And part of that problem is because a lot of peer review is a black box. We just don't have a lot of information about what journals are doing, what processes they're putting in place, how they're ensuring the quality of the work. And that's a problem, right? And in psychology, we've had a big revolution in light of the replication crisis, pushing for more openness and transparency. But a lot of that is just about the transparency of the research itself and not the transparency of the process. But the same journals that are pushing researchers to be more transparent are themselves not being very transparent about their process. And I want to be clear here, I don't mean that everything about peer review should be transparent. I think there are some things that need to be closed, but I think there's a lot more that could be transparent, and we could ask journals to be a lot more open and accountable about their processes than they currently are. So my feeling is that at least for the short-term future, journal prestige is here to stay. Whether we like it or not, there's going to be higher prestige journals and lower prestige journals. We have to accept that reality as we're training our mentees, those who want to stay in academia. They have to factor this into their decisions. But we don't have to give it away for free. I think that we tend to kind of continue to give the same journals the same amount of prestige and not ask very much of those journals. And I think the time has come to ask and expect more of journals. So I think we need to raise our expectations of journals. So what do I mean by that? So first, I think that journals should state their goals. So journals can't value everything. They can't want to be the best at everything. So they should say, what are their priorities? Are they more interested in publishing really cutting edge, novel, groundbreaking stuff that might turn out to be wrong? Or are they more interested in publishing really solid stuff that's more likely going to be incremental and less likely to be right at the cutting edge? There's different kinds of priorities you could have. You could be interested in publishing more applied things or more theoretical things and so on. So first of all, journals should make that clear so we can evaluate them according to what their own aims are. And so then they need to give us enough information to allow us to evaluate if they're meeting their goals. And I'll get into that more later. I think journals also need to make it easy to catch errors, biases, and corruption at the journal. And I'll give more concrete examples of what journals can do. And then they need to invest in processes to correct those errors, biases, and corruption when they're found out. So this is, a similar spirit to the transparency that we ask of authors when they're publishing their research, that you should allow us to find errors and consider the processes and the things that would be necessary for someone to detect if there was a problem in your research, if there was bias and so on. And this is consistent with the motto of the oldest still existing scientific society, the Royal Society of Science, take no one's word, right? We have that attitude towards the research itself. And I think we should also ask journals to not just take their word for the fact that they have a really high quality peer review process or they're picking out the best research, but let us evaluate that. And I'll get into what that means a little bit more in a second. So some specific things that journals can do, and these are, this is just a very partial list, and many of the talks and posters at this conference are about what journals can do. So there's many things that have been being discussed. So for example, in psychology, it's becoming more common to actually name the handling editor on every paper. This allows us to see if there are conflicts of interest between the handling editor and the authors, for example. Publishing the peer review history for accepted papers, at least. Require, with a little star, authors to share their data code materials, because more transparency in the research article itself also allows readers to evaluate how good was the peer review process, were there obvious errors that could have been caught, et cetera. Offering article types for criticisms, replications, and verification, and not putting too many limits on those article types. So many journals have really, really strict limits about like the time window in which you can submit a critique of a published paper or how long those critiques can be and so on. And then there's more like very kind of abstract things that journals can do, like encourage editors to own their decisions, not just vote count the reviewers' comments, and to give justifications for their decisions as well so that they can be accountable if there is an error or bias in their decisions. More things, they can declare conflicts of interest when editors publish in their own journals. We did a survey in psychology journals. There were 0 examples of articles where this was declared as a conflict of interest. It's just not a norm in psychology, but it obviously should be, in my opinion. Having clear policies for things like appeals. This is when we can debate whether it's better to mask authors' identities from reviewers and editors. But if you're a journal that values not having bias based on the author's status or geography, as we heard was a factor potentially in some cases, that might be something that you do. And you can go as far as conducting audits of your own journal. So if you say that you are ensuring that the work that you're doing is reproducible or replicable or whatever you're saying is a standard that you hold your research to as a journal, then do audits and see if you're meeting your goals. Or at the very least, allow other people to do audits. So this is why requiring the research itself to be reported transparently makes it easier to be held accountable so that other people can go in and test, well, is this work reproducible like you say we can expect it to be? So what I'm arguing is that we can scrutinize journals' claims of superiority. We don't just have to take their word for it. If a journal says we're the most selective and we're picking the best research, we should be able to say, okay, let me find evidence of that. And if we can't do that, then they don't deserve the prestige. If a journal's not giving us enough information to be able to go in and check how often are there conflicts of interest, or how, is the research reproducible, or whatever our standards are of what we should expect of that journal, then we shouldn't just give them the prestige because they promise us that they have a good process. And when journals fail us, they should lose prestige. So a critical example of this in my field of psychology, you may have heard of the reproducibility project in psychology that came out in 2015. It was one of the major events in the replication crisis in psychology. So it was a big team of researchers tried to replicate 100 different studies in psychology. And many people remember the headline about the fairly low rate of reproducibility of those articles. But even within my home field of psychology, when we talk about that study, people forget that those 100 articles, that many of which failed to replicate, were drawn from 3 specific journals. And if you ask psychologists, what were the journals? Many psychologists don't remember. So even though we remember that this was bad, the outcome was bad, this was a problem for our field, that bad reputation did not stick to the journals. And full disclosure, one of those journals is the journal that I'm now editor-in-chief of. And what we should be asking those journals is, what did you do in light of this? So there was this meta research that showed that you probably have a replicability problem at your journal. What have you done since then? That was 10 years ago. So right now, the incentives for journals are we're ranking them and giving them prestige on things that only reward them for successes and don't punish them for errors or failures. So things like journal impact factor, there is no consequence to a journal's impact factor if they're publishing irreplicable stuff or even fraud, right? And so if journals get credit for successes but not responsibility for failures, they have every incentive to encourage hype and even fraud, right? If a journal can only increase in prestige by publishing amazing things, and there's no consequence if they recklessly publish things that turned out to be wrong, we're gonna get bad things, right? So errors are not problems in themselves. I'm not saying that we should give more prestige to journals that never make mistakes, right? We wouldn't want journals to never make mistakes. It's okay to publish things that turn out to be wrong. And in fact, a journal may even advertise itself as like, we're gonna publish big if true things, but don't believe everything you read in our journal, right? Like that would be a perfectly legitimate identity for a journal to have and say, look, we're aiming for like a 60% replicability rate. That's our goal. So we're going to publish lots of things that turn out to be false, but they're going to be really exciting things and people should follow up on them. And if they then are stand the test of time, then you should publish them. Sorry, you should believe them. But what's a problem is when journals are publishing things that have preventable errors, or they're encouraging hype through their incentives. They're saying, you know, you need to convince us of how great your research is, and they're not putting in checks to make sure that if people are exaggerating or misrepresenting the work, that it's going to get caught. And if there's not enough investment in error detection and correction, those are irresponsible ways to make errors for journals. So the goal is not to have 0 errors, but just to prevent the ones that are preventable and make sure that you do what you can to get things right. So it's okay for journals to publish risky findings, and it's okay for some findings to turn out to be false, but risky claims should be presented as such. There should be truth in advertising, and we should hold journals accountable to their performance. So if they are publishing a lot of things that turn out to be false and they're not advertising themselves as that kind of journal, then there should be consequences for their reputation. Okay, so which journals should get prestige? This is a really tough question, right? The easy answer is the best journals. But of course, that's the million-dollar question is which are the best journals. But I would argue that even if we don't have a really simple answer to that question, we can begin to answer it. We can say, okay, there's not just one definition of best. But let's start with the basic requirements. For any journal that wants to be a top journal, there should be some things that we require. And this might be discipline specific, but some of the things I think are fairly universal based on first principles. So the submissions themselves, the manuscripts, have to be reported transparently enough for reviewers and editors and eventually readers when they get published to evaluate their claims. If the journal is not even requiring authors to report things completely enough for peer reviewers and editors to evaluate the claims, then they can't possibly be doing a good job of peer review. And if it's not reported completely enough for readers eventually when they're reading the published article to evaluate the claims, then we can't hold journals accountable to say, are you doing a good job in peer review? So that's, to me, a basic requirement. And what that looks like will depend on the field, right? The peer reviewers should be encouraged, and the editors, one of their focuses should be the accuracy of the work, right? We don't just want to ask reviewers, how important and groundbreaking is this work? We also want to make sure that part of what we're asking the peer review process to do is detect, flaws and problems in the research. We're not going to catch all errors, and some kinds of errors like fraud, I think, are going to be very, very hard to catch, but it should be the concern about accuracy and the focus on accuracy should be one of the things that the peer review process encourages. And the peer review process should be transparent enough for the community to evaluate. So what that means, again, we can debate and it might be different in different fields. Personally, I think there's not a good reason to not publish the peer review history, at least for accepted papers. I think that's a small step because we still don't see the peer review history for all the other papers. But in my view, I think that allows at least a little bit of a window into what the peer review process looks like. I remember one time I criticized on Twitter, back when Twitter was a thing, that a social science replication paper that targeted articles that had been published in Science and Nature, tried to replicate those. And it ended up being published in another journal, not Science or Nature. And the authors had said, we tried to publish it in Science or Nature and it got rejected there. And so I had tweeted, like, I don't think this is a good look. I think that Science and Nature should have published this, in my opinion, rigorous replication paper that was kind of a verification on the social science studies published in those journals. An editor at Science replied to my tweet and said, you're not allowed to judge because you didn't see the peer review process. And I said, well, first of all, I'm allowed to judge because I can read the paper, so I can have an opinion about whether it was a good paper or not. But also, it's not fair. You can't tell people that they can't judge because you hid something from them. So in that case, I mean, it's complicated because it was rejected from the journal, so there's not an easy way to share the peer review process. But still, I think the journals should welcome criticisms of their decisions. There should be a rigorous discussion about whether peer review processes at journals are fair and rigorous. And I think at least publishing the peer review histories for accepted articles is a step in that direction. But then, there's many things that not all journals need to value, and we don't need to hold every journal to the same standards. We want diversity and pluralism about what is the best kind of journal. So different journals could have different emphases on methodological rigor or theoretical value or applied value or innovative methods or, yes, impact and novelty. I think we want some journals that value those things. And other journals could value different things. So there's this is just obviously, again, just a few of the many, many things that journals could value. If journals tell us explicitly which things they are selecting on, which things they are valuing, which things we can depend on being true for the manuscripts that they accept, then we can evaluate them by their own standards and say, are you doing a good job of achieving these goals? But they can't value everything. And so this was a nice blog post by a colleague of mine who said, groundbreaking or definitive, journals need to pick one. A journal can't claim to be doing everything. And this is, I think, one of the many trade-offs we have to make as journal editors is how much do we want to publish like big if true things and how much we want to publish incremental but solid things. And sometimes there'll be things that are somewhere in the middle. But again, if a journal says what their values are, what they're prioritizing, then we can evaluate them on their own standards. So which journals should get prestige? Those that meet whatever we consider are absolute basic standards of like a minimum that a journal should do. And then those that meet their own standards and have standards that we respect as like valuable standards. But we can be pluralistic about that. We don't need every journal to have the same standards there. But to do that, we need better research. We need evidence, empirical evidence about which journals are doing well on which dimensions, right? And this will help us, it's not the only factor, but it will help us make more informed decisions about which journals deserve prestige. Now, I heard earlier in Malcolm McLeod's talk, he talked about how a lot of meta-research is quite shoddy, and I agree, I'm a meta-researcher myself, and it is quite hard to do really good meta-research. There's a lot of overclaiming, making causal claims from observational data, et cetera. But I would take issue with one point that, he said there's not enough experiments, and I think experiments are great. He also said there's a lot of research that only identifies problems and doesn't find solutions. And I would say I think there is a really important role for descriptive research that just identifies problems. And I'll tell you a little bit about that, specifically with respect to my field of psychology, leaning on other people's work, other meta-researchers' work, and tell you a little story about how this research, I think, did really play a big role in pushing for change in psychology. So, for example, there's some research led by Tom Hardwick looking at the prevalence of transparent research practices in psychology. This is actually a follow-up paper from one of his earlier papers. So he'd done a couple of different surveys so this is purely descriptive research looking at how often articles in psychology engage in different open practices. So this is at the level of the article. So not targeting specific journals, but doing a survey of different samples of journals. So this is, for example, the proportion of articles that share data openly. And the first result is from a field-wide survey of a random sample of articles in psychology published between 2014 and 2017. It was 1.6%. And then in this newer paper, he did a follow-up looking at a field-wide random sample of psychology articles and also a random sample of psychology articles in the prominent journals, more prestigious journals. And you see that in that time period from the earlier time to 2022, it went up an order of magnitude. So that's a huge change, right? But it's also in absolute terms still quite low. So only about 15% of articles in psychology in 2022 had open data. We find similar patterns for analysis scripts. So it's gone up, but still in absolute terms quite low. And we could break down this data by journal if we had enough data. In this case, I don't think there's many articles per journal because it was a random sample across many journals. But we could be asking these kinds of meta research questions for each journal, and then we could be holding journals accountable to say, well, what's your target? What percent of articles do you think should have open data? Maybe it shouldn't be 100%, but I would argue that in psychology, it should be a lot higher than this. There are some barriers to sharing data in some cases, but I don't think it's in 80% of cases that data should not be open. There's other meta research that has looked at the reproducibility of articles in psychology, and I'm going to show very quickly just three meta science projects that were all purely descriptive, all quite narrow in scope, and actually all targeting the journal Psychological Science that I'm now editor-in-chief of. So one was led by Tom Hardwick, looking at analytic reproducibility in articles, specifically ones that shared their data openly. So this was at a time when this wasn't required, so these were authors who opted into sharing their data, and they found that even then, only 36% of the 25 articles they looked at were reproducible with author involvement. It was higher, 60% after author involvement. There were a couple more studies looking at later years, so that one was, I think, 2014. This one is looking at 14 articles in 2019. Only 7% were exactly reproducible, 29% were essentially reproducible. And then there was an undergraduate thesis, actually, that looked at 80 analyses in just 3 psychological science articles, more recent, 2022, 2023, found that 50% were entirely reproducible, 63% were mostly reproducible. So this meta research was really pivotal in our decision later on. When I became editor-in-chief, I hired Tom Hardwick to be the senior editor for statistics, transparency, and rigor. And we decided, okay, we're just going to require open data and open code, so analysis scripts and materials. And we're going to do reproducibility checks before we accept an article. We do allow for exceptions in cases where that's what's in the best interest of science, so to protect participants, privacy, things like that. But the meta research that these people did, that was fairly descriptive. It's hard to make causal inferences. There's not, no grand claims from it, but it was about our journal, and it was really, really helpful for us in making these decisions to change our policies and implement, more rigorous standards for computational reproducibility. And in fact, when we decided to do this, so I wanted to hire Tom partly because he'd done this excellent meta research and done this huge service to the journal in looking at these things. And we recruited a team of statistics and transparency editors, and that team was pulled largely from people who had been critics of psychology practices on issues of transparency, and many of them critics of our journal in particular. And I think that's the best advice I have for journal editors is hire your best critics. They will make excellent team members to help improve the journal. So some of the new policies that we've implemented at Psych Science that I hope will help increase kind of the credibility of the research that we publish and help us earn our reputation as a prestigious journal, or maybe find out where the problems are. So some of them in brackets were already policies at the journal, but I think they're good policies. So naming the handling editor, we now publish the peer review history for accepted articles. We require open data, code, materials. We've changed the limitations and restrictions for submitting critical commentaries, replications, things like that. We now require that if editors publish in the journal as authors, they declare a conflict of interest. We've also really discouraged them doing that at all. We have a clear policy for appeals. And then maybe the biggest one is we conduct reproducibility checks at conditional acceptance. So when a manuscript is about to be accepted, then we do an in-depth reproducibility check. And we've also partnered, I think I have a slide for this actually. Yeah, we've also partnered with the Institute for Replication. So this is a team mostly of economists. They started out looking at economics journals where they do audits of journals and check the computational reproducibility, and they publish a paper each year reporting on what they found about the computational reproducibility of the work in those journals. So they, again, mostly focusing on economics and political science journals, but they started a partnership with our journal, Psychological Science. So now we're going to get an audit every year of the reproducibility of the work that we publish. Just in case this sounds like an advertisement for my journal, I hope it doesn't sound that way. And I want to be clear that I think that most journals are not earning their reputation, and I want us to be held more accountable. I want people to expect more of us and to demand more of journals. And I think this is reflected in my the title of an article I wrote for Wired magazine, actually before I became editor-in-chief of Psychological Science. I was shocked that they would still let me be editor-in-chief of a journal after I wrote this article. But just to be clear, like I don't mean to be saying that journals are great or that Psychological Science is great. I think there's a lot of things that we could be doing better. And I think that we often get handed prestige without having to earn it. And I would like the scientific community in general to expect more of journals and ask more of journals and make sure that we're giving prestige only where it's earned. So I'll go back to this slide, but maybe change the font size and say, I think the main message I want to get across is just that we can expect more of journals. They have a lot more room to improve than we often talk about, and we should expect them to be transparent and accountable just like they expect us to. Thank you.
Stick. Okay, here.
Florence LaCroix, Georgia State. I love this. Really love this. The question is, how are you going to make them accountable? Because, okay, this journal, you've done the studies, their reproducibility is terrible. They don't do this, this, and this, but there's so much inertia. How are you going to let people know that we've got to drop this from a high to this? I mean, that's, I think, the hardest thing is getting that communication out there to the researchers, actually to the guys who promote us.
Yeah, it's hiring and promotion committees, funding agencies, like all the people who are using journal name as a proxy for quality. We need to update them and say like, yeah, that journal name should actually signal something different than what you're using it to signal. But that's going to be, that's very idealistic, I know. The easiest thing I think we can do is, so it's hard to make sacrifice and compromises as authors or whatever, but as reviewers, let's just stop reviewing for the prestigious journals that don't earn their prestige, right? We can choose to give our reviewer time to the journals whose values are aligned with ours and who actually act in accordance with those values and who have demonstrated that commitment. So that's where we can start, right? I think if we just tell everybody, hey, you can't always only submit to the journals that align with your values. You might not be able to have a career if you're that idealistic. But there's no cost to only reviewing for journals that align with your values. What's the worst that's going to happen? They're going to stop asking you to review? Oh, no. No. So that seems like the place to start, really, is to rally people around, okay, the way we can change the prestige hierarchy, at least a foot in the door, is by only donating our reviewer time to the journals that have shown us that they're doing a good job.
John?
John Ioannidis from Stanford. Samin, amazing talk as always. Probably I'm among the most biased people on planet Earth in favor of reproducibility, asking for more reproducibility checks. I love what you're doing, introducing more reproducibility in your journal, but I'm thinking of 7 million papers published every year. Where are we going to find workforce to have reproducibility checks on 7 million papers? What cost, what resources, effort, what waste will come out of that? And along the same lines, I might question some of the other, markers or initiatives. For example, blinding the authors' names. I mean, we know that this is not feasible much of the time. There's even randomized trials with mixed results. Not really very big effects.
Yeah.
I think it may vary from one discipline to another. It is some extra effort with very questionable impact, or editors owning the decisions and reviewers not being so important. I would argue that if you look at the horrible journal impact factor metrics, most of the highest impact factor journals have professional editors who are really work very hard, but they're not experts in the field. And this is why they ask reviewers. So I really worry that if we say, oh, don't look at what the reviewers say and just be a strong editor, that might be a recipe for disaster, no?
Okay, so I think you have two different points. So one is that some of these recommendations might be bad recommendations, so they might not apply. So in psychology, we have almost 0 journals with professional editors, so it's almost entirely academic editors. So from that perspective, I think the editors should be making independent decisions informed by the reviews, but I can't speak to journals with professional editors. Maybe that is bad advice. So for the recommendations that aren't good, we just shouldn't do those. But and I think we need more meta research, and we need to be discipline specific in our recommendations. So I take that point for sure. Your other point is that some of these might be good ideas, but they're not scalable, right? So let's take those. I think computational reproducibility checks would be an example of that. I don't see much downside other than the practical issue. And I would say, okay, let's not ask everybody to do that. Let's ask the journals that we're giving the most prestige to, the ones that are controlling career incentives, that are getting people hired, getting people grants. So in psychology, that would be, psychological science would be one of them, but also like PNAS is super prestigious in psychology, or science or nature or whatever. Why aren't those journals doing it, right? those journals have no excuse. They have many of them. Okay, let's not pick on specific journals, but the journals that are the most prestigious in any discipline, often they have a big profit margin. Why aren't they investing some of that profit into paying people to do computational reproducibility checks? And why are we letting them off the hook and giving them prestige without asking for that? We'll talk about all the other journals later, but to begin with, those journals that were giving away this prestige, that were letting control our hiring committees, our grant committees, things like that, those tokens, those rewards are then turning into more and more success for the authors. Why not expect those journals at a minimum to do these expensive, hard, heavy lift things? I agree we're not going to get them across the board. So let's start with those.
Mike?
Hi. I wanted to ask a little bit more about your theory of change. It seems like, especially asking the top journals to implement these changes, they're at the top. They don't really have, they might have a moral incentive, but
Yeah.
the rules as they stand right now, the status quo has kept them in the position they're in.
Yeah.
So I guess what I'm asking is, who is the we or the institution that's going to actually
Yeah.
incentivize them to put in these changes, whatever they may be?
Yeah.
And then thereafter, who among those in power is going to actually reap the benefits
Yeah.
of that situation? Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have a great answer. So my experience in psychology is that even one actor in this space can make a really big difference. And I think if we can get one prestigious journal in a field to change, then I think it really puts everyone else on notice that, like, okay, it's possible to do this. So why aren't the other journals doing it? And then people start to realize, oh wait, actually, yeah, we do trust the research published in this journal more because they are checking these things or they're doing these things. So I don't know how you get that first one other than kind of infiltrating, getting people with good values to put their hand up as editor, trying to get them in positions of power. I mean, I think that there's a lot of lessons from psychology's replication crisis and revolution. One of them is that, those of us who were kind of shouting loudly during the replication crisis, and we were fairly early career and marginal, but some of us, I mean, there's a lot of attrition. There's a lot of really great people that the field lost because we weren't valuing the right things, but we ended up with a few people in key positions. And then we were able to implement change in those positions. So I think like encouraging people who care about rigor, who care about transparency, who care about many of these things to take on these leadership roles. And with the idea that if you can change even one corner of your discipline, if it's an important enough corner, it really does, I think, put pressure on the other players, the other gatekeepers and so on. And it at least starts the conversation of like, well, if this journal is doing it, why aren't you? And so I think certain key kind of high profile, it doesn't have to be just journals, but other kinds of leaders, professional societies can do this, funders, et cetera, can, I think, set an example for others. And I've seen this in other fields as well. So I think my theory of change, I guess, is like, keep pushing, get the right people in the right positions. If you try enough, eventually there will be some gatekeeper in an important enough position that can make some change. And then that really, I do think that has a ripple effect if you can get
Thank you.
that to happen.
Great. Steve?
Sure. Steve Goodman, Stanford and Annals. So wonderful talk. A couple things. First, you mentioned the reproducibility project. I didn't remember the journals. Well, we also don't remember the 99 of the 100
Yeah.
results were statistically significant. I think the project could have ended right there. It would have
Yeah.
been a lot cheaper because you could reproduce the results just with 2 random numbers if you know that they're only going to publish statistically significant results. And I did that and I got the exact same number they got after 7 years. But I was intrigued that you never said anything about truth.
Yeah.
So all these things you're talking about, we think are surrogates for reliability and ultimately will lead to proper statements of how likely this is to be true. But you didn't talk about, and I'm not saying it's necessarily the role of journals, but it's ours as a community in assessing the journals, is how many of the studies that make strong claims or intermediate claims or whatever turn out to be true. And that has to be assessed 5, 7, 10 years later. Some of that has been done a little bit, not necessarily by journal, but we could easily do it by journal and then calibrate back. And as you said, risky study, we shouldn't penalize them for risky studies, but they should be labeled as risky studies. And if certain number of those turn out not to be true, we can go back and look and see, was that labeled as risky? So why don't we include some sort of gold standard here, which is follow-up to see which of these theories or which of these claims
Yeah.
actually turn out to be true.
My guess is that it's because it's so hard to operationalize actually turn out to be true. And that might be easier in some fields than others, but in social psychology, you would not get 10 social psychologists to agree on which theories actually turned out to be true, even the ones in textbooks, right? I mean, maybe my field is in particular turmoil, but I do think that's a challenge, right? So we can say which ones replicate, which ones are reproducible, which ones, get cited more, which ones
Right.
haven't
So
been
that's a problem for
retracted.
the epistemology, but
Yeah.
there are things in medicine that we do think are true.
Yeah,
Otherwise we'd all here be dead.
yeah, yeah,
So like everybody dies, that's true.
yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Vivian?
Hello? Yeah, I'm here from University of Santiago, Chile. So have you costed this and who is paying for it?
Yeah. It's not sustainable or scalable, I will say that. So, I mean, I think that part of what my goal is, just speaking for myself, is to try to do it as much as we can and then get the community to expect it, to see the value in it and want it. And then that will put pressure on journals and publishers to fund it. So right now there's a lot of volunteer labor going into this. One of our star editors, Olmo van den Akker, is here. You can ask him how many hours he spends on computational reproducibility checks. They get a tiny little stipend, like much of academic editing work, it's mostly volunteer labor. And that isn't a long-term model. So I think that we're at a phase in this evolution where it's only going to happen with a lot of passion and energy from people who care about this. But then if we can show that it's important, we're doing important work, then maybe there will be pressure on publishers.
How is the
societies.
journal funded?
So it's a paywalled journal. It's owned by a professional society, published by Sage, but it's subscriptions. Yeah. Yeah, so I don't like the business model of the journal. There's a lot of things about this that are not ideal and not how I would want it in the long run. And I hope that this is kind of a step in the evolution towards a better model. But I mean, I think we are starting to collect evidence, both like empirical evidence that we hope to be able to publish on a bigger scale, but so far it's mostly anecdotes because we're still early enough in our term. But there was, for example, one manuscript where it got to conditional acceptance. The reproducibility check was kind of needed more data. There was back and forth with the authors about, okay, we need this data file, we need that data file. The authors were kind of resisting. And then eventually got to a point where the authors emailed us and said, we're withdrawing our manuscript. We found an error in the data. And it was only because of the reproducibility check, right? It had been through peer review, it had been through a lot of scrutiny and so on. And so if we accumulate stories like that show, hey, we prevented an erroneous finding from getting into literature because we invested all this time and so on, then I think that will build a case for why societies, publishers, or wherever the money is coming from, why some of that money should be invested in these kinds of checks.
Michael?
Alejandra Clark, online from Biology Open, says amazing talk. Thanks. How long does it take to do the checks? You've kind of got at that at the prior question. And has the policy affected submissions to the journal?
That's great. So how long it takes to do the checks varies by manuscript, a long time. So it does delay. It adds a delay. It adds it at conditional acceptance. So I think the authors are relatively okay with that delay. We also allow authors to preprint their submissions. So we're not delaying the sharing of the manuscript if the authors want to share it. But a month, 2 months sometimes. So quite a delay. Some of that is that my field of psychology, people aren't used to sharing analysis scripts, for example. So they're not well commented. It's hard to make sense of them. So we hope that part of what's happening is kind of growing pains, that it'll become smoother and faster to do these computational reproducibility checks. What was the second question?
Has it affected submissions to the
Yeah.
journal? Are people shopping elsewhere?
Yeah. Who knows about causal inference? Submission rates are the same, if not a little bit higher than before the policy went into effect, but maybe they would have been even higher without this policy. I don't know. Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, we're at time. So thank you very much to the great presentation.